Deadlift. Alright, so what's good technique? Many people have a visual in their heads, some idea of what good technique is, and usually it's basically pretty, right? Good technique looks pretty. But in reality, that really doesn't have to be the case, especially when you're training hard. You may grind, you may shake, there may be some knee focus with squats. It doesn't always look pretty. Effective technique is not always the most visually appealing. Good technique also does not equal slow. Repetition tempo is a separate variable to consider, and we'll discuss that in detail later in the course. But suffice to say that you can have good technique and train fast. And you can also have terrible technique and perform a movement slowly, which makes it look excruciating. Momentum can also be very valuable, also something we'll discuss in more detail later. But the strategic use of momentum can be very effective. Good technique also doesn't have to be smooth. Some exercises have inherent biomechanical sticking points. Almost every exercise, in fact, has a sticking point. For some, it's just more pronounced than other points. It's good to realize that for a squat, for example, the sticking point is at a hip angle of 90 to 110 degrees, which is about halfway through the movement. And there, most people have to grind. So for most people, that is simply the point where your force production, your strength, is relatively low compared to the resistance, which means that that is the point where you have the least amount of force production capacity, and that's the point where you'll struggle the most with the exercise. So it is normal that during a heavy squat, when you're close to failure, someone will come out of the hole relatively fast, grind to almost at that stop, and have great difficulty getting through the sticking point, and then once they grind through that, they can explode relatively fast throughout the last bit. That is simply the biomechanics of your strength curve, your force production capacity, compared to the resistance from gravity. There is nothing wrong with that, nor is there anything you need to do about that. Sometimes good technique also does not equal safe. Generally, you want exercises to be safe. However, for example, for a powerlifter, there is a trade-off between performance and safety. For example, with the round back deadlifts. And some exercises also slightly compromise on safety. For example, a Bayesian fly, which you'll learn in the course later, is basically a regular fly, but with a cable instead of a dumbbell, and with the arm internally rotated instead of a regular grip. And the internal rotation of the arm, of the shoulder, basically increases the angle with the fibers of the pecs, which means that they have a more direct line of pull, and it should be capable of exerting higher tension. Some people, however, find that internal rotation of the shoulder also puts more strain on the shoulder, and some people cannot do it at all if they have shoulder problems, and they would be able to do, say, a pec deck. But in that case, there is an inherent compromise to be made between performance and safety. For a deadlifter, deadlifting with a round back, especially round upper back, is generally a good trade-off, because if you deadlift with an arched upper back, that is theoretically safer, but you'll be able to lift far, far less weight during the deadlift. Whereas if you allow your upper back to round, it does compromise safety a little bit, and most powerlifters deadlift with a flat or a rounded upper back and a flat lower back, which is generally a good safety profile in that it's relatively safe and allows for near maximal force production. Good technique, in general, what is it? It's the biomechanics that stimulate the desired training adaptations. So good technique is dependent on what you want from the exercise, and it's context dependent. There is no such thing as universally good technique. It may differ per individual and per goals, what you're trying to do with an exercise. So there is no such thing as the perfect squat or the perfect deadlift. Different individuals can perform it in a slightly different way that's suited for their goals and their body structure. And it's very good to realize, because many people have a very black and white view of technique, where they think this is good technique and anything that deviates from this is wrong. That's really not the case, and as we'll also go into in a few of the exercises, many components of good technique are highly variable. There are a few things that are important, which are the fundamentals, the important things to consider, and then there are variables. So for the squats, for example, first exercise of today, the essentials of the squat is that the bar is over the center of gravity with a roughly vertical bar path. As we discussed earlier, because gravity pulls straight down, the most effective bar path in a squat is straight up and down. If you see a beginner squat, they may sort of fumble over forward, and some people may end up in sort of this position, like the squat morning position, which isn't even a good position for a good morning, because it's not nearly a vertical bar path. It's very inefficient to have the bar go back and forth, let alone out to the sides or rotate. So the center of gravity normally is above the midfoot. So basically, if you pull a straight line through about the midfoot or the heel, it's going to be in between the midfoot and the heel, depending on the individual. The bar should stay basically in that region. Shot from the side, if you draw an illusory line, which you won't be able to see this, if you draw a line like this all the way up, then the bar should stay in roughly this range. That's efficient movement. Very important for safety is neutral lumbo-pelvic alignment. So the lumbo-pelvic complex is the pelvis, the hip bone basically, and the lumbar spine, which is the lower back. It should be in its neutral position, which for me is, I have reasonable anterior tilt, and it means that this is roughly the position you want to stay in. You can be a bit more arched, so a bit more like this, but you do not want to be in this position. This is posterior pelvic tilt. So the pelvis is anterior tilt, posterior tilt. What many people experience is that the arc in their lumbar spine flattens in the bottom position and their pelvis tucks under, more informally called butt wink, when basically you end in this position. And if you just squat low enough, everyone will have that, basically, unless you have extremely hypermobility. If you just get low enough during a squat, you will at some point need to round your back. Everyone will have a point, thus, that is basically their maximum active range of motion, which is as low as they can go without losing that neutral position of the lumbopelvic complex. That is the maximum depth you want to achieve with a squat. And also the depth you should always aim to achieve. Because up until that point, more range of motion generally equals greater muscle growth and strength development. So there is a compromise. Like I said, every individual has a maximum active range of motion that can be performed safely, because as soon as the lumbopelvic complex loses its arc, the reason that that's bad is that the spine is very well suited to resist compressive force. So the vertebrae in the spine, which are all the components of the spine, they are very strong when they are like this. But when you lose the arc and you round like this, you get shearing forces. And that is not what the spine is very good at resisting. These shearing forces increase dramatically in major exponential fashion with even very slight basically changes in the curve of the spine. So if the spine flexes even a little bit, that can absolutely majorly increase the amount of shearing force stress on the vertebrae and cause injury. And the pelvis also, many people actually, a lot of people have sacroiliac joint sprains, which is basically the tailbone, the very bottom of the spine. They sprain that area on either side, and they mistake that for lower back pain. The cause is exactly the same. It's the pelvis tucking under, which usually occurs along with flexion of the lower spine, the lumbar spine. But usually if it's only on one side and it's very at the bottom, it's more likely to be a sacroiliac joint sprain than actual damage to the spine. Either way, it's pretty much the same problem, same solution. So, but it's good to know. Now the variables of the squat. So this is pretty general, right? And then we have some things that are more variable. So the bar position and the grip. There are many grips. You can front squat, so you can put the bar on the front delts. Then you can also put that with a clean grip, which means the bar is like an Olympic weightlifter. You can do a crossover grip on either side, which is more bodybuilders do. You can also grab it with, you can mimic the clean grip if you're not flexible enough to use it. Put straps around your hands or around the bar, and then hold the end of the strap like this. You cannot put your bar under your hands. You hold the strap like this. You can also squat with a high bar, so on the upper traps. I'll show that in a bit. Low bar, which is on the lower delts, the rear delts. And some people actually have a mid-bar position. I also have a mid-bar position, which is a groove formed somewhere in between the traps and delts, which is also actually a very stable position. So depending on your individual structure, there are many different ways you can put the bar, and it doesn't really change the exercise that much. It changes the range of motions and the joint torques, but all in all, it's a relatively similar exercise, and all the same general principles apply. Head position doesn't really matter in itself. Often, head position it can be useful to cue head position because it often translates to movement in the spine. If someone is very prone to overarching, for example, looking forward or straight down to a spot on the floor generally prevents that. If someone has great difficulty arcing enough, it can help to keep the head a bit more up, especially during deadlifts. If someone has their head up like this, you're not very inclined to have your spine do this, right? Whereas if you're looking down, you're more inclined to have the spine round along with the neck. So generally the spine sort of follows the neck, but in principle, what the head does doesn't matter, and you can turn your head to the side, and you can even look the other way. If all the rest of your body is performing the movement, ideally, it doesn't really matter what your head is doing. Now, stance and knees. It is generally important that the knees track over the toes, but which direction exactly they go depends on your stance. So you can have more of a narrow stance with the feet straight forward, and then you're more like a folding harmonica. Most people cannot go very low that way. So most people will want to be shoulder width or slightly outside of that, with the feet pointed 5 to 45 degrees out. One of the most successful cues generally, if someone has trouble squatting deep enough without bounding over their back, is to push the knees more out. Many people think the knees go forward, while in fact they should go over the toes. And if you, especially if you're doing it yourself, it feels like it's a lot more, the knees go way, way out. So if you have your feet 45 degrees out, which is all the way like this, these should just actually stay all the way like this, which is way out. And many people are more inclined to put the feet out like this, but then the knees go forward. And that theoretically increases stress on the knee, which is called knee valgus, if the knee buckles in compared to the line over the toes. However, you'll find that many strong lifters actually have some knee valgus, and it's also normal to have a little bit of a wobble in there during the squat, during the upward phase. So it's not the end of the world if the knee isn't 100% over the toes, or if it buckles in a little bit during the movement. Just make sure that someone is still stably put and they are still standing on their mid feet or the back of their feet. They should not have caving in of the foot like this, and they should also not have their knees buckle in way like this, which is neither good for strength development nor safe for the knee. However, between different stances, you change the range of motion for different muscle groups a little bit, but it doesn't really affect the exercise much. With a very wide stance, you involve the glutes more, but that's only at a very wide stance. And beyond that, whether you squat like this, or more like this is all within the very normal range. Yes.
Should we tilt the camera because we are not seeing you?
Oh, you don't see it on the camera?
Your feet are just cut off.
This one.
There you go.
Yep.
Do you now still see the
Yes.
PowerPoint?
Yes.
Right.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So you don't want the feet to go. You want the center of gravity to stay over your mid feet / heels. So you want to remain firmly positioned like this and not have the foot lose contact with the floor like this with the knee buckling in. Or theoretically, you also don't want the feet to do this, but almost nobody does that. So that's basically the general principles. And now Bernice will show you what it actually looks like in practice.
And so, for instance, the bounce is not a component for a squat. The squatting until death, as to grasp, for example, and using the bounce every time to go out.
You can have you can squat with bounce, without bounce, as long as you retain good neutral lumbo-pelvic alignment, it's fine. Sonic, can you film? Because we have to, we're here.
Yeah.
All right, let's start with...
Did you introduce...
yeah.
Did you tell who Bernice is?
Yeah, so this is IFBB Pro, Bernice Sangers. Be sure to check her out on Instagram. I've worked with Bernice quite a long time now, right? Let's start with the difference in bar position between high bar and low bar. Start with high bar. You see that the bar is positioned on the upper traps. And this groove, basically, this is a very stable groove. In general, any bar position should be very stable. If you find the bar is slipping off your back, it's not good. It's not the right position. Even with the front squat, it should be relatively comfortable. Now, comfortable in this sense, meaning you may get bruising the first few times, but it should not slip. And compared to any other position on the spine, near or above or below it, it's a lot more comfortable. Let's do low bar position. So you see that the bar is on the rear delts. In Bernice's case, there's not a major difference. Some people actually have the groove formed by the rear delts, which is more here, and then it's like the bar is sort of halfway on their back. You also see that if you move your hands outward, you generally need to have somewhat of a more narrow grip with the rear bar position, because you need to form that groove with the rear delts. So this is still perfectly fine, but if you would go all the way out to the sides with your pinkies on here, then see this becomes hard, and some people will not be able to actually, there's no more groove here. And Bernice is quite muscular, so there's still a groove on the rear delts, but many people find that they actually need to have the elbows in a little bit more. Other than this, it doesn't matter how narrow or wide your grip is. And for many people, if you use a thumbless grip overhand, you can do a high bar, by the way. This position is the easiest on the wrists and elbows. If someone has elbow pain from squatting, solution is almost always widen the grip, use an overhand grip, put the thumbs on the bar instead of below it. There is no reason, in principle, to have a more narrow grip. It's more stable and increases, sometimes it decreases how much you can lift because it's more stable, but for the legs, it doesn't change the training stimulus. So if you're not a power lifter, where it's extremely important to squat as much as humanly possible, or as much as you can, then it doesn't matter what your grip is. And it's much more impactful for your training that you don't get elbow injuries, wrist injuries, etc. So for many people, I like the overhand grip and quite wide. But if you can go narrow, that's great because it's much more stable. Right, now let's do some actual squatting. Probably best if you turn 90 degrees so people can see you from the side. And just do a couple reps. So you can see that the bar stays over the center of gravity. And now if you go beyond your active range of motion, so you go into the bottom position, not parallel, further, 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 and now just keep going. You'll see that she will lose her arc. So if you, now you go slightly up, and now very slowly go down, and just keep going down even if you lose the arc. This is still good. This is still good. Now her pelvis is slightly tilting, but not actually much. So she's actually quite flexible. And she could actually, this would be bottom line. So now the pelvis is stuck, but her spine is still very flat. Her spine is not rounding yet. So many people would be more like this in that position, right? Where the lower back is actually completely flexed. I can go back up. And for everyone, you want to determine where that position is. So in general, women are more flexible than men. Can you squat super wide? If your knees way out. This is like what many powerlifters will do. You'll probably find that this takes a lot of getting used to squat like this. And you'll find that if you keep going down, 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 down. Yeah. So she cannot go as low like this.
So the tip of the toes are where the arms are?
No, it doesn't matter. She can widen her grip, she can narrow in her grip. It doesn't really affect the exercise itself. So just your feeling of stability. Right, you can rack the bar. Once you know how to squat, deadlifting is not that hard because you want to, that same limbo pelvic complex, the neutral position, you want to retain that during a deadlift as well. But the deadlift is much easier. The same principles apply. Bar over the center of gravity, you want a vertical bar path, which means you keep the bar close. So a lot of beginners are inclined to let the bar sort of gravitate forward, especially in sort of turn it into a stiff leg deadlift, where it's more like this. You want the bar close. In fact, many people will want the bar literally scraping their shins, being careful not to touch the kneecap, and then literally coming over the thighs. That's how close you want the bar. You don't have to literally scrape your body, but for a lot of people, that is perfectly fine. Again, you want neutral limbo-pelvic alignment. You want all the movement to come from the hips, not spinal flexion. So for most people, if you do a Romanian deadlift, for example, which is generally what I recommend more often, about this point, this is hip flexion, and now I can get my hands lower, but that's spinal flexion. I've got some questions after.
Should we record this?
Yeah, he's recording.
Okay. So you want all the range of motion from the hips that you can get, but not to go into spinal flexion. So during, especially Romanian deadlifts, you want to just think of pushing your butt back, as if you're trying to touch the wall behind you. Butt back, that is the movement. Many people think that range of motion equals distance of bar traveled, but it's flexion of joint degrees of joint flexion. So at this point, I have reached maximal hip flexion. And now you can get the bar lower via scapular protraction and spinal flexion. And I can touch my toes quite easily. But that's no longer hip flexion range of motion. And it majorly increases the risk of spinal injuries. So that's what you do not want to do. A Romanian deadlift is different in that it's just this. This is a Romanian deadlift. And a full deadlift you do from the floor. I generally recommend the Romanian deadlift because a full conventional deadlift is basically restricted in range of motion by the arbitrary radius of the 45-degree plate. During a Romanian deadlift, most people can get full hip flexion. During a deadlift, you don't. And you also don't get nearly full range of motion for the quads because you basically end up you start off in a half squat position. So, whereas in a squat, you get down to like here, during a deadlift, you get to about here. So, the range of motion for the quads is very little. It's not even 45 degrees for many individuals. For the hips, you also don't get full range of motion. So, deadlift off the floor is basically a jack of all trades, master of none type of exercise. I'll get to principles of exercise selection and what constitutes good exercise later, but in terms of range of motion and the like, you're generally better off with a Romanian deadlift or a squat for any of the target musculature. And the Romanian deadlift also has the benefit that it's much less injurious and much easier to teach. So I generally recommend squats and Romanian deadlifts over regular deadlifts, unless of course you're a powerlifter. Now the variables, the scapulae in the neck, doesn't really matter. Some people say you should keep your scapulae retracted. Those people cannot deadlift much. Nobody deadlifts a lot of weight with their scapulae retracted. Nobody. Try it for yourself, actually keeping the scapulae, the shoulder blades retracted, like this. This is retraction, this is neutral position, this is retraction. See how much you can deadlift. It won't be much. You need to have the scapulae in neutral position, or they might even protract slightly, so they come up slightly like this. That's fine. Most people are best off, not even in general, unless you're doing the bench press, which we'll get to later. For most exercise, most people are best off forgetting they have scapulae, or what the hell they're doing. Because they have things like upward rotation, and most people cannot even visualize how that happens. So you're best off not thinking about what the scapulae are doing, just let them do intuitively what happens. We'll get to questions in a bit. The neck position as well. The neck again leads the back often. So people that are prone to hyperextend and do too much this, it can help to make them think more of contracting the abs and looking down a little bit and brace. And for people that have difficulty maintaining their arc, it can often help to look up more or forward and do this. because the spine often follows the neck. So if I do this, I'm inclined to also do this with my spine, and if I look down, I'm inclined to let the spine follow. But in principle, it doesn't matter what your neck's doing. It's not a safety concern because the loading is below the neck. Footwear and straps. Some research indicates that the use of a heel lift decreases force output and power during deadlifts because you want to drive from the hips, and it's basically a back-forward movement. And if your hips are elevated like this, you cannot produce force effectively in that direction because you don't have the stability. So most people are best off not wearing shoes at all, or minimalist footwear, or something like Chuck Taylor's, which has minimal heel lift. Straps are perfectly fine for most people. You want a double overhand grip because you don't want an asymmetrical stress on the spine. Asymmetrical grip, so a mixed grip, even has asymmetrical effect on lat activation. So it goes down the posterior chain and affects muscles and joints throughout the entire upper body, possibly even the lower body. And nobody ever ruptures their biceps with an overhand grip, while with a mixed grip it happens occasionally. So there just isn't much to gain from a mixed grip. Unless you're a powerlifter, you cannot use straps in competition, then you absolutely have to use the mixed grip if needed to hold the weight. But if you're not a powerlifter, straps are perfectly fine, especially women. It's very natural that your posterior chain will outpace your grip strength, and many women are just simply not genetically capable of holding without straps what they can deadlift with their lower body. And men at some point often as well. In fact, it's a very good mark to see if someone has potential for powerlifting. See if they can deadlift as much without straps as with straps. If their grip is not a limiting problem, there's a very good chance they'll do well at powerlifting. And people that need straps very early on in their career, in their lifting career, are often not meant will not be the best powerlifters. All right, so let's do the Romanian deadlift. It's all very simple movements, a pure hip hinge. The key consideration is stance and the like. You can just point the feet straight forward, feet pretty much directly below the hips. You can go a little bit wider, personal preference. All the essence of the movement is just the hip hinge. Yeah, Romanian. So bar stays close, pure hip hinge movement. And now show what happens if you get to the bottom position, pause, go to the bottom position, pause, and now go all the way down, like further. It's harder to see in her case. Now you see that here is, the spine is actually still flat, but she has posterior pelvic tilt. And for most people, you'll see that, you can come back up. For most people, you'll see that once they get to this position, then the spine already starts rounding. So, but she does lose her arc, because you can see now that this is much more of an arc than what she had flat. So, and now you see that she definitely flexes, she loses that arc. If you now go back to your actual bottom position, like with good form, you can see that she's still, so this arc is still there. So in her case, the spinal flexion is the loss of the arc, and that's also spinal flexion. Right, good. The overhead press. The overhead press, you have the bar, you press it overhead. It was once a staple of powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting, although we're pretty much still the same thing. Again, you want the bar over the center of gravity with a vertical bar path. So just like with a squat, you want the bar basically to be in a vertical path from the mid-feet / heel all the way up. Now that means that you need to move around the bar. Many people move the bar around their head. That's ineffective. That means you have to move the bar like this, and it becomes much more of a front raise movement. Because as soon as you do this, you're basically doing a front raise. This is no longer a press, this is a front raise, this part. So you want to be in this position and press the bar vertically up. To do that, you will need to move your head out of the way, and you will need to flex the glutes and maximally arc the upper back, and actually lean back a little bit for most individuals. Otherwise, you will not be able to have straight forearms and be in this position. It's perfectly fine to lean back. It has a bad reputation because people started to abuse it with iron belts in the Olympic Games. And they basically just turned it into an exercise where you're like this. And they could do that because they were wearing iron belts. Without the iron belt, it's not as much of a problem. And most people are not nearly as flexible enough that they can make it such a gymnast move. So for most people, perfectly fine to actually press the knees a little forward or the hips forward, and that induces a little bit of knee flexion, and you get into greater range of motion. So in this position, you see that the elbow is behind the body. Whereas in this position, which is what most people think that should look like a military press, you should stay perfectly upright, you have less range of motion. This is more shoulder range of motion than this. Basically, you get this extra part of range of motion by leaning back. Moreover, you're stronger, at least after you've learned that movement, so you can lift more weight over a greater range of motion, which is more tension on muscle fibers. You want to lean back, but you don't want lumbar hyperextension. Many people get back pain if they try to arc like this. The solution, flex the glutes. That makes sure that all the arc comes from the upper back, the thoracic spine, and not the lower back, because the lower back is what gets injured. If you hyperextend the lower back, the vertebrae are strong like this, they get damaged like this, but they also get damaged like this. So hyperextension can be just as problematic as rounding of the back. Flexion. Range of motion, you want full range of motion. So like I said, you want the bar to go all the way down and touch your clavicle or upper chest in the bottom position. Don't stop before that, there is no reason to. You want more range of motion. And in the top position, you want full Olympic lockout. Bodybuilder lockout is basically like this. And you're missing that last part of range of motion. You want the bar fully overhead, which means that your arms are actually slightly behind your head, fully above your center of gravity. Again, no reason to compromise on range of motion. Now, the variables here are grip width. You can go a bit more narrow, a bit more wide. I like to go slightly wider than most people want or intuitively do, because the key target in my mind for an overhead press is the side delts. Front delts take a beating with any kind of press you do. It's almost never needed to emphasize the front delts in a program, because they get worked with so many exercises anyway. The side delts, however, are aesthetically much more of a problem to develop for most people, and much harder to target, because bench presses and the like also target the front delts, but not the side delts. So I like to have a bit more wider grip and focus on this movement rather than this movement to stimulate the side delts. Leg drive is something you do not want to use because it's basically a pure form of cheating. You can do it strategically if you want eccentric overloading, but generally you turn it into a very different exercise. And an Olympic push press is not at all like a barbell overhead press. An Olympic push press starts with the bar in the front squat position, and the entirety of the first part of the range of motion is done by the legs. You literally squat the weight up so explosively that you throw up the weight, and only by the time it's about here do the delts actually start producing much force. And by that time, you actually duck under it, and you sort of, you basically catch the weight. So it's like you throw up the weight and then you duck under it. So there's not actually much pressing taking place at all. Which means it's more of a leg exercise than a shoulder exercise. Wrist position. So this is something that is a bit individual, but I like to have the wrist kept straight, because if the wrist bends over backward, it increases stress on the wrist, also on the elbow, because basically as soon as the bar starts coming to this point, you're doing a triceps extension. So if the bar is here, this is pulling the stress outward like this, which puts stress on the elbow. If the forearm is vertical and the bar is exactly here, directly above it, there is much less stress on the elbow. So you generally have fewer problems with the wrist and the elbow, and there is also the theory for greater performance, because force transfer is maximal when the bar is directly over the elbow. Any upward movement of the elbow translates into upward movement of the bar. Whereas if you have your elbow slack backwards, it's like if you ever bench pressed with one of those wobbly bars, it's so much harder because there's slack in the bar. Just like if there is, if you're squatting on unstable footing, it absorbs some of the force. So if you're squatting on a floor that's made of foam, for example, you cannot squat much, because you're putting a lot of force into the ground, but it's not coming straight back up. If the floor is extremely hard, all the force you put into the ground comes back up because the floor is going nowhere. So it's a pure reactive force up. But if the floor is made of foam, you have some of the force that sinks into it. And just like if your wrist is slacked backwards, it's basically an elastic component, and there is a force leak there. So not all of the force is translated into upward movement, some is translated into the movement of the wrist. So if you can keep the wrist directly vertical, that is generally best for joint health and should be best for performance. Okay, let's see the overhead press. Side. And then push the hips a little bit forward and go to full Olympic lockout, top. So if you do bodybuilder lockout, you go to, say, here. And if you do full Olympic lockout, you go all the way overhead, like this. You see that she intuitively also puts her head slightly forward. This is full lockout. And you go all the way down, and basically to the bar touches your clavicle. So Bernice is quite flexible, and she can actually do it with the bar touching her upper chest. Most people want the bar touching the clavicle, so further towards the throat, more like this. And then you need the hips to come slightly forward, allow the knees to slack a bit, don't keep them perfectly straight. Hips forward, and now you can, you should, if you push the, yes, like this a little bit forward, and now you let it come down. You should be able to keep the wrist straight, but you see that in her case, she can actually already do it with the bar, basically on the upper chest. We'll do a couple reps. And let the bar come all the way to the clavicle. That's good. All the way to the clavicle. Yeah. That's good. We'll go to the pull-ups, chin-ups. So pull-ups and chin-ups, the difference between those is that during chin-ups you use a supinated grip, so you're facing your own hands, and with pull-ups your hands are facing away from you. It's a difference in terminology, it's completely arbitrary, but that's how most people use the terms. So the range of motion during a chin-up, you want full range of motion. During a chin-up, that means you're pulling yourself up so far that your hands or the rings or handles that you're holding should touch your shoulders or your chest in the top position. Many people think, or actually based on the name, they think full range of motion is when your chin goes over the bar. That is for two reasons a terrible strategy to use, because one, it motivates you to get your chin over the bar rather than pulling yourself up, which results in kipping and doing this. And many people pull themselves more back and then they sort of lunge their chin forward. You just want to pull yourself all the way up until your hands or the bar are touching your chest/shoulders. In the bottom position, you want a full dead hang. You want to go all the way down, and that includes slightly relaxing the scapulae. So you don't want to keep the scapulae retracted, just intuitively let them come up slightly in the bottom position. So you go to a full dead hang. If someone would basically start pushing you and you would start swinging, that would be the position you would end up in. You won't, if you do that, you don't naturally sort of cramp your shoulder blades together. There's no reason to do that. A good chin-up/pull-up does not have any kipping, because just like leg drive for the overhead press, it turns it into more of a lower body exercise than an upper body exercise. And the movement pattern is very different. Actual kipping pull-up, as you do for CrossFit, for example, is actually more pulling yourself away, and then you kip with your legs, drive from the hips, and then you throw yourself forward. So there is a much greater back and forth movement, and during that you can also do a muscle up. You lunge yourself forward, and basically what you do is if you have the bar here, you go back, you kip with the legs, and then you come forward and you try to sort of throw yourself over the bar. That's very different from a strict chin-up. variables are grip, so you can use neutral grip, supinated grip, or pronated grip, and pronated means it's a pull-up. Neutral grip, it's a bit dubious, you can call it neutral grip pull-up or chin-up, both are correct. And there aren't that many variables, pretty straightforward. So, right?
Gaan we even proberen hoor.
You can do it here.
Zet die kant op.
Yeah, just chin up is fine. So yeah, that's full range of motion, and that is full length of position. So you see that her hands are literally touching her shoulders in the top position. Can you do one more? Yeah, so her hands are literally touching her chest, and now she is at full range of motion. Good. Right. So that is a full chin up. And a pull up, you can do the same, but most people, it's very, very, very hard to do a full chin up, full pull up that way. So for most people, you can use pull ups with either chin above the bar, or two other points that generally prefer is chin on the bar. And that restrains a lot of kipping and involuntary movement because you'll break your jaw. So for most people, if you literally force them to put your chin on the bar, then you have a pretty consistent end position that does not have much cheating. Or you have them only pull themselves up until their elbows are in line with their body. And then you have full range of motion for the lats, but you could have more range of motion that would be produced mostly by the scapulae and the rear delts. So if you mainly want to target the lats, you can just pull yourself up until your elbow is in line with the body. Because hyperextension of the shoulder is not done by the lats. The lats only pull the elbow down until here. This point of range of motion is the rear delts and scapular retraction. The chin on the bar is generally a good ballpark for pull-ups. Alright, and then we have the bench press. The essentials of the bench press is that in this case, you are forced to have a J-curve as your bar path. Because whereas any other barbell exercise you want the bar path to be as vertical as possible, that is impossible with a bench press. Because you are forced in the top position that you have straight arms and the bar is here. But to keep a vertical bar path in this position, the bar would have to come straight down all the way until here. And that would be a guillotine press. Now you can do that if you have iron shoulders. For most people, however, it will result in shoulder injuries very, very quickly. Because the bench press, what is seen as an advantage, is actually a major disadvantage in that the scapulae, the shoulder blades, are restrained from moving. They are fixed to the bench. And that's also why you get so many shoulder injuries with the bench press, because the scapulae are not free to move. During a cable chest press, for example, or push-ups, the scapulae are free to move. And the shoulder has a lot of freedom of movement. During a bench press, you do not. Now, to circumvent that, you want to retract the shoulder blades, because if you have them fixed in place, the safest position is full retraction. That opens up sacroiliac or subacromial joint space. And you want to extend the thoracic spine. So you want to drill your shoulder blades into the bench and arc the upper back. So chest up, shoulder blades back. Basically the front relaxed pose, as they call it in bodybuilding, which is this, which is not relaxed at all.
Yeah.
So if your setup position for the bench press is comfortable, you're doing it wrong. It's very uncomfortable because it's not a natural movement. Even more so, or much more so than the other barbell movements, the bench press is absolutely not an intuitive or natural movement. And most people will need to have a J-curve. Basically, they will need to have the bar come to nipple line or lower. Anything above that often results in shoulder injuries because of the fixed position of the scapulae and the great degree of abduction with maximal range of motion for the pecs and the shoulders, which is a very injurious combination. To get that bar path, you're basically looking at an exercise more like this, which means you slightly tuck the elbows instead of letting them come all the way out like this. So movement is more like this. And you want the forearms to stay vertical, just like for the overhead press. Then you get maximal force transfer. You get the fewest elbow and wrist problems. Straight wrist, bar in the thumb, not slack backward, and definitely not a suicide grip. It's called suicide grip for a reason. Vertical forearm, vertical wrist, J-curve, bar path. So setup is retracted scapula, extended thoracic spine, and you actually want to use leg drive in this case, which is not actual leg drive like an overhead press. It's leg drive in the sense of stability. So the force from your legs is not translating into upward movement of the bar. All your legs are doing is fixing your body in place. Because the scapula cannot move, you want them retracted, drilled into the bench, and basically kept there by your legs. And you'll find that this adds up to a few % strength for most people because you are much more stable. It's like bench pressing is like you're performing an exercise on a ship. The more stable the ship is, the more you can bench. If the ship's hovering all over the place and you're not a tight setup, you can't bench as much. Range of motion, you want full range of motion, touch your chest in the bottom position and fully lock out the arms at the top. Unracking is actually very difficult. Most people will find that as soon as you get over body weight with your bench press, unracking becomes as much of a problem as difficult as the exercise itself, if not more so. You generally want to be quite far back. And there's a lot of people that say you want the eyes directly below the bar. If needed, if it makes unracking easier, just set up further away. As long as you're not so far back that this touches the bar, you can just go further back and it makes unracking easier. Because if you need to grab the bar all the way up here, it's much more difficult than if it's here, of course. So there's no reason to make it more difficult for yourself. Just put the bench back as far as needed. If you need to spot someone, then you should generally only help them unrack the bar or help when the bar starts going down instead of up, when it should be going up. If you ask someone to spot you, you need to tell them this 5 times. It's a written rule somewhere in the universe. 5 times, at least. It's the magic number. You need to instruct them. I actually wanted to produce a shirt, still might do it. And they call it the one true bench shirt. For those that don't know, a bench shirt is what powerlifters wear. It makes you bench more. And it says upside down, so you can only read it if you're spotting. If you touch the bar, I will destroy you. That's the one true bench shirt, because that's what the spotter generally needs to hear. Most spotters in the commercial gym, if you ask someone to spot you, they will intervene at the first sign of struggle, which basically means at the first opportunity they see to start doing biceps curls, they will seize it and they will mess up your set. So it also helps someone to ask someone to help you unrack the bar rather than spot, because spot seems to be a synonym for barbell curls. The variables, grip width. Generally, I prefer quite wide because the target, as I program it, mostly is the pecs. The bench press is not that great an exercise for the triceps or the front delts, so might as well target the pecs because you don't have many other great presses for that. If you do a wider grip, it generally emphasizes the pecs in the sense that you don't want full tuck, and if you can't bench without shoulder pain, without a full tuck like this, then often I'd say you might as well not bench, because this is almost no pec movement anymore. You want this. This is what the pecs do. So the pecs move more horizontally rather than vertically. So you want the grip wide enough that you actually have a lot of range of motion coming from the pecs, but you still have a large range of motion, because if you go even wider than needed to get this movement, you get into this position and then you get lack of range of motion at the top, because you end up here and now you have straight arms and you're missing all of this range of motion that you could get with, say, a dumbbell. And that's also a reason that dumbbell bench presses might be inherently superior to a barbell, purely for pec growth, because you get more range of motion, more freedom of movement. All right, let's do the bench press. So drill your shoulder blades all the way into the bench, chest up. And then lower it. Lower the bar further, slightly widen your grip. Keep your forearms and wrist fully vertical. Go, and now down, So if you want to bench press this wide, you would need to go all the way that wide. So you want to slightly narrow in your grip. It's not super comfortable without racking, but slightly narrow in your grip. So come hands closer together, a bit less. And now go down to a bit less, basically bottom of your bra probably level. Yeah, so this is about the level where you can still have vertical forearms. And then ideally you also want the wrist to stay perfectly straight, which is not super comfortable if you don't rack it. Good. Yes. Alright. Good. And with leg drive, you can do it tucked and untucked, which means basically if you're on the bench, this is also a lot easier. Actually demonstrate it. So the setup for a bench press. Basically you need the bar here because you actually need to touch it. If I do pinkies on the rings, you want to drill your shoulder blades all the way back, and I have tucked leg drive, which means if I now press on my legs, I will do this, which means almost no movement, but if I let go of the bar, I can press myself up. That is what you want from leg drive, because that will basically stabilize you in the position. Notice how my shoulder blades are all the way back. I cannot put them back any further. My chest is all the way up. Also cannot put it up further. If I want to do powerlifting, I would use even more of an arc and also arc the lower back to shorten the range of motion, but as a bodybuilder there's no need for that, so you stick with this. And you can also use leg drive untucked, which is like this, and you can also press yourself up like this. So it doesn't really matter if you tuck or untuck, whatever makes you more stable. As a powerlifter, the goal is simply use whatever technique to lift the most possible weight. So nothing else matters. It's that simple. So it's just a matter of experimentation. See what leg drive, what grip, anything helps you lift the most weight. That's all there is to it. So that's a major difference with muscle growth for recreational trainees, where you want high range of motion and effective exercise, whereas a powerlifter, all you care about is how you can lift the most weight or get the most weight out of the rack, put it on your chest and put it back. Anything else, it doesn't matter. And you do anything to get to that level. So and that's also for many of the powerlifts a big difference in the advice powerlifters give, is because they will train with that goal in mind, and that's very different from seeking the optimal training stimulus.